Welcome to another episode of Assess That with Tom and Nat.
And happy Monday, everyone. We hope everyone had a great weekend.
I'm looking forward to this episode as it's something that you and I are adamant about. But before we do that, let's check in. As we say on our other podcast, unleash yes, as we do. As we must. Let's see if you finish it.
Okay. So let's do a check-in question. And let's think about this one. And we're going to go a little bit. Usually these check-in questions are kind of fun.
Yeah.
But this one's a bit deep in a way. And the question is, I know it's kind of cliche, but what's one thing you would say to your 22-year-old self if you had a chance to go back and talk to your younger self? 22 for you is a lot closer than it is for me. And it doesn't have to be about teaching. It could be about anything. Like what is something you would tell your 22-year-old self in looking back?
I'll just go. I mean, there's some deep ones that I could probably get into, but I think I would say your curly hair isn't as bad as you think it is.
So much for deep.
I know. That one isn't. But honestly, it's going to sound like for people, for the women listening who have fought with their hair their entire lives. Like I have been blow drying, straightening, and putting hair extensions in my hair for the better part of 20 years. Yeah. This curly hair thing. If you're listening, I have very curly hair right now. If you're watching, you can see it. It's a very new thing. And it was like almost emotional taking them out and letting my natural curls come through. But I think what that masks is something deeper, which is everything that you think makes you such a loser is actually the best parts of who you are. And I think at 22, you're trying so hard to fit in and trying so hard to be cool. And I wish I could just go back and be like, everyone that you think is cool is actually not that cool. Stop wasting so much energy on them and trying to fit in with them and trying to look like them, Yeah.
I think I would go back and tell my 22-year-old self that the worst case scenarios that we imagine, the fear mongering we do by perseverating on the worst case scenario almost never happens.
Yeah.
And a tangent from that would be you're going to be able to handle a lot more than you think you're going to be able to.
That one.
Like I think we have, and I do understand because none of us like to be surprised or look silly. So we perseverate on worst case scenario or we express skepticism because it makes us sound smart. And I do think that we spend a disproportionate amount of time thinking about the possible negative outcomes, and we rarely leave the space for what if the best case scenario could occur.
Yeah.
I think I would go back and tell myself that all of these hyperbolic sort of hypotheticals that you imagine are going to happen in your life, disasters and destruction and all of this stuff, they just almost are never going to happen, and that you are going to be able to weather almost any storm that comes your way, and you will come out of it wiser and better for it as a result of it. So I think some of that comes with age and maturity and experiences. Not always age, but I think experiences and maturity and all of those things can do that. So I think that's what I would tell my 22-year-old self for sure.
We both probably not believe ourselves.
We probably would say,
all.
oh yeah, what do you know?
Idiot. Get out of here, boomer.
All right, let's jump into it. We're going to focus on percentage-based grading again. And we talked a little bit about this with Danielle last time.
We did.
But we're going to focus on why percentage-based grading, despite its appearance of precision, and we talked about the illusion of precision, is one of the most misleading elements in education. So we explore how the numbers can mask growth, they can distort fairness, and undermine teacher professionalism.
Then we'll show why professional judgment remains essential even in outcomes-based systems and how educators can use it with clarity and confidence. Ultimately, this episode is going to be about reclaiming trust in the human side of assessment, the side that no algorithm can replace.
Right. So that's today's plan. Let's get to it. Okay, today we're talking about one of the most misunderstood and most essential parts of assessment, and that is professional judgment.
Yep, because we've all heard it. Just show me the percentages. The numbers don't lie. Or a parent even asking, wait, how did my child drop from an 86 to an 82? But grading is not supposed to be just a mathematical calculation. There is supposed to be meaning behind it.
Exactly. And we've built systems that look precise, but aren't actually accurate. So today we're going to unpack three things. We're going to look at first, what's the problem with percentages? We're going to dig into that. And we've talked about this in the past to various degrees, but we're really going to drill down on this idea of percentages. Number two, why that's a problem for learning and for fairness, why percentages are that problem. And then three, we're going to talk about the solution. What does it look like? How do we reclaim our professional judgment, which always has to be a part of our grading systems?
Yes, because if we want grades to be credible, fair, and reflective of learning, learning, we can't outsource our professionalism to a calculator.
Okay, so here's the first problem. And the problem is what we talked about with Danielle last time and what we're going to talk about today, which is this illusion of precision. So let's start with kind of a classic example, right? So you have one student, let's give them 3 percentages in order. They get a 60, a 60, and then 100. Then you've got a second student who gets a 73, a 73, and a 73. Now, both of those students have a mean average of 73.3, right? That's for both of them.
Okay. And so obviously, if you're listening or watching, these stories couldn't be more different.
Right.
The outcome, the grade, looks the exact same, precisely 73.3. We even have 1 decimal point in there. But student A demonstrated mastery and growth over time. They started at 60, they ended at 100. Student B plateaued.
Yeah.
They stayed pretty stagnant at 73% the whole time that they were engaged in this learning. This is a problem that we have in these percentage-based systems because they don't see the learning. They just count and calculate.
They just count and calculate. And that's the illusion, right? That's the illusion of precision. We act as if the difference between an 86 and an 87 represents a meaningful difference in learning. And it's really within a margin of error that we're talking about here. That's all just noise.
Yeah, and Thomas Guskey, a prolific researcher in this area, said it best when he said, percentages create an illusion of accuracy without any real precision.
Right.
So we've mistaken decimal points for fairness.
For fairness. The second illusion is objectivity. We use numbers to hide behind the fear that our professional judgment is going to be seen as either subjective or inconsistent.
But guess what? All assessment and grading is subjective.
Yeah.
And I think we have built such a fear of that phrase because what we want to be able to do is to throw our hands up and say, oh, wasn't me.
That's how the grade's calculated.
Numbers don't lie. Don't come at me, parents. Don't come at me, admin, anybody. It's just how it calculated.
Yeah.
But this is just a complete myth because even behind every single percentage grade, there is a judgment. There is put the word judgment aside because that even sounds negative. It's just there was a decision. There was a decision that was made. Okay, so you made a math test. How many questions? How do they get points for showing their work or not? How are they supposed to show their work? What kinds of context did you provide for the word problem? What kinds of scaffolds were there or not there? How much time did the decisions. So every single thing that we do with assessment and grading is ripe with decisions. So the better question is, how do we become more bias resistant in the judgment that we are going to exercise and the decisions that we are going to make, but trying to assume just because there is a percentage scale that it's objective and that it's precise is completely just erroneous.
Yeah, that's such a great point because there is always judgment. It's just hidden. It's hidden behind the math or the arithmetic, right? But why 4 questions and not 6 questions about adding fractions? Why that topic, this topic? What's the cutoff for full marks? Those are great points. But the numbers make us feel scientific, right? But they're built on a foundation of teacher decisions, as you've just outlined. And then we layer on systems that reinforce this illusion by calculating grades to a single or even 2 decimal places, where we assert there are 10,000 distinct levels of performance. And it gets into this ridiculous idea that there's that many levels of performance that we can distinguish between.
And these systems, just so we're naming them for what they are digital grade books.
Yeah.
That especially in all of our Canadian provinces up until grade 12, we are almost completely beholden to. And these platforms were created by companies that were created by people who don't have education degrees. They just saw something that seemed like a quick solution based on their experiences in school that were, lots of worksheets and things were counted, that if you can create a system that just counts all that stuff, great. And then we can have like this ticker tape for parents so they can get grade updates really quickly. But they've actually taken their old experiences of school, put them into a modern context, and now we're all stuck with them. And how do you take away from parents this idea of you get constant updates on exactly where your kid is at, even though it's a false promise?
Treating the grade book like it's the stock market, looking for every tick up and every tick down. Most Canadian provinces, as you say, still have percentages at the secondary level at least, or at the upper grade levels. It's baked into report cards. It's baked into the student information systems. And when I was a high school student back in the early 1980s, we had percentages too, but they were converted into letter grades. And so there actually was a range or a margin of error that was built into it. And then we got into the electronic grade books, as you say, and the tech boom brought about this idea of the over quantification of learning. And that got us down this road of everything being about a decimal and too much of the science and not enough of the art around grading. So that whole system really taught teachers and conditioned them not to trust their judgment and not to trust themselves.
100%.
And that's the irony. Like, our systems that we've created actually undermine the very professionals that the system relies on to make it work. So we actually undermine ourselves by trying to step away from our judgment.
Let's go even deeper now, Tom, to why this, obviously there's a lot of problems inherent in that, but going deeper, let's start with what percentages do to the learning, because what they are doing is they often fragment it, because we're taking something as complex and multifaceted as learning and then isolating it into points instead of really zooming out and saying, okay, between all these data points, what is the connected story of learning that's actually unfolding here?
Right. When we average, you end up distorting that story, right? So let's imagine a student goes from 50 to a 60 or an 80 to a 90. The average might say 70. If you put all of that together, the 50 to the 60 to the 80 to the 90, we might say, oh, that's a 70. But the pattern is screaming proficiency. The trend is screaming proficiency, but averages, mean especially, doesn't acknowledge trajectory or more recent evidence.
Totally. So the average punishes this idea of early, like low or slow learning at the beginning, or making mistakes. Yet at the other side of our mouths, we're saying it's okay to make mistakes. It's a natural part of learning. But then we permanently record those mistakes and say, actually, it's now going to undermine all of your growth and future opportunities. So you better not make a mistake. Yeah,
and it causes kids not to take risks. They don't want to take the risks if they know it's going to cost them in the grade book. But like you said, learning is messy. We say, it's okay to take risks. It's okay to fail. It's okay to do poorly. That's all what learning is about. But then my early failures cost me in perpetuity in the grade book. And that leaves me feeling, hesitant to put myself out there or to take those risks. And then we start labeling. We start to say, oh, he's a 60s student, or he's a 60%, or she's an 80% student, or he's always a 90, or she's always a 95. We start to label them, and these labels start to forge into identities, especially when kids get into high school. Like they get in that secondary level, they start to forge those identities.
Have you ever seen those parent bumper stickers that are like, proud parent of an A student?
Yeah.
Seen them. So you start to become this like label, and it might sound like I was a fully grade grubbing like nerd in high school who was the A+. And that sounds like it might be a good thing, but it actually creates a frighteningly fixed mindset. So if you have a parent with the bumper sticker of proud parent of an A student, the last thing you want to do is expose yourself as anything but an A student. So I often described it as I went into like this mental purgatory with a crippling fear of failure, an obsessive quest for perfection. And when you're living in that space, you're not doing anything that authentically is learning. You're just kind of performing and making everything look polished all the time. And when you have a system that rewards you, like we talked about with Danielle, for effort and just looking like you're participating, you can do that. You actually can create this whole like illusion of learning and getting all the right grades and everything, but not actually undertaking anything in which you have to struggle.
Yeah, and kids put limits on themselves, right? They start to look at their grades and they say, well, I'm, Ms. Fardabasso, I'm just a 70s kid, relax, try not to push me so far, because they it's not just the data, those are internalized limitations that come up. And this is where I think, I often think of Rick Stiggins, someone who's an early mentor for me way back in the day. Shout out to Rick and Jan and Steve and Judy at the Assessment Training Institute in Portland, which is where I cut my teeth on the assessment work. He always argued that when the numbers replace judgment, we start measuring the wrong things with greater precision. And this is a former psychometrician. So this is not somebody who was against the numbers generally, but this is somebody who recognized that when we get too clinical about assessment, we start being more precise measuring the wrong things. And I loved it when he would say that.
I love that so much. I remember an assessment manifesto I read by him once where he talks about even the most precise assessment and grade that results in a student to quit trying is a completely imprecise assessment.
Right.
Because if it has that effect, then what do we care if we got it down to a point, whatever. Yeah. But that human side of it is so important. And so this is where the human side comes in for teachers, because there's a huge fear factor here that we haven't talked about yet, where they might know. Most teachers kind of know if you really push them and they had some truth serum, they're like, yeah, it's kind of a smokescreen for a lot of imprecision behind the scenes. Yeah. But they are so scared of the questions they'll get if they remove that smokescreen. Like, can you justify my kid's 3 as opposed to, it's precisely an 82%? Or, what if a parent just pushes back, period, and says, how did you determine this? How did you count this? How did you arrive at that number? What if your admin starts pushing back and saying, well, I just want to see the evidence of the points and the student work. Yeah. So there is a lot of fear that comes up if you're going to step away from this place of things just are counted and calculated and it had nothing to do with me. I'm just the objective observer.
Yeah. But that fear is real.
It is real, not downplaying.
As much as you and I rail against these practices, we recognize that the fear that teachers and even some administrators fear, it's real, right? But the fear isn't evidence that you and I are wrong. It's evidence that the system is outdated. And this is something I talk about. I call it the grading trap, which is where it's not just students, but it's actually teachers who get trapped in a system. It's no one person's fault. Yeah. But we get into a system where, can you imagine a teacher who takes a student from a 50 to a 60 to an 80 to a 90 and then reports a 70? The teacher themselves don't get full credit for the work that they accomplished with that student because we're saying they're a 70. But they're actually not. They've actually grown to a level of competence that is far beyond that. So the system itself traps teachers into this place where they don't actually get the full acknowledgement of what they've helped students accomplish. So
that is such a good point. That is such a good point. And I think despite the fear that comes with professional judgment, I think it's that first word that we have to really come back to is there is no teacher in the world that doesn't want to be treated as more of a professional. Yeah. And if we want to step into that space, we have to then hold on to this thing that is professional judgment to really be that professional that we want to be seen as.
That's right. We have to reclaim this. And I think this is the work that you and I do a lot. And sometimes I find myself in situations where I feel like I'm in a bizarro world where I stand in front of an audience in a workshop and I'm advocating for their professional judgment and people are looking back at me saying, no, we can't do that. I'm like, wait a minute. I know. Advocating for your professional judgment and why it's valid because there is no perfect calculation. There's no algorithm that is infallible that you're going to, you can step behind. So let's talk about reclaiming this professional judgment because that is the solution, right? Yeah. And let's start with what it actually means to use your judgment. So let's redefine this. Professional judgment isn't an opinion. So teachers listening right now, when you think about one of their biggest fears is that a parent will push back and say, well, that's just your opinion. It's not my opinion. It's my professional judgment. It's an informed decision. And it's about me interpreting as a teacher, me interpreting multiple pieces of evidence through the lens of my own expertise. I always say to people, if you want subjectivity, take the assignments to a construction site and ask the carpenters to sort through them. That's subjectivity. What you do is your professional judgments based on your experience and your expertise. And that part is what we have to help people understand and reclaim so that they can explain that to parents.
Yeah. And this is incredibly necessary, even if you're already in an outcomes-based system. Because some people might think, well, we have clear criteria, we have rubrics. Yeah. Ergo, it's now just objectively a 4, a 3, a 2, or a 1, according to our rubric. But you still need to decide within that team. So which evidence counts the most? Like which really is going to be that summative piece versus the formative piece? How recent does the demonstration need to be? Could I emerge in September and show you an exemplary demonstration of learning? Would I be exemplary? Do I need to maintain that throughout the year consistently? So the next question is how consistent? Yeah. If I was exemplary at the very end of the year, but I was mostly proficient throughout the entire year, would you lean more on that consistent demonstration or that one-off exemplary evidence of learning against the criteria? And even on the note of criteria, I had literally this debate with a team down in California because they've been doing this for years and they didn't really collaborate on it much anymore. And they're like, no, it's pretty objective. Like 4, you have this criteria, 3, this criteria. And so at the next meeting I said, can everyone bring an example of a 4? You know exactly where this is going.
Yeah.
Varying, like very different interpretations of what that means. But please don't misunderstand Tom and I as, oh, see, it doesn't work. This is a problem. Because that subjectivity is there in everything we do. We've just created this illusion of precision with the percentages and counting, because I've seen this happen with high school math teams where they brought the same math test to the table and then debated why they awarded certain points for showing work versus anyways. I could
and percentages with the type of error that students make. There's different types of incorrect answers. Rather than saying an answer is right or wrong, there are degrees of incorrectness that can lead to us going through that. So I think, and this is one of the most important things I think we're going to say here, which is that rubrics are not answer keys, but, and hear this clearly, listeners, rubrics guide judgment. Okay, this is actually there to guide your judgment, not replace your judgment. A rubric always requires a teacher to make an indirect scoring inference by saying this demonstration matches that description on the rubric, right? So that's the part we have to think about. In fact, the clearer and more sort of articulate your criteria is, the more defensible and actually the more responsible your professional judgments are.
Okay, let's transition, Tom, into why judgment is still necessary, even in this context of criteria. Because, okay, think about this scenario. You've got two students who both have technically met the learning outcome of can write a persuasive argument supported by evidence. Like a lot of us are working towards something like that in any of our spaces. So one student can do it very clinically on multiple topics. Another one can only do it at a level of sophistication. Both technically meet the outcome, but we need to use our professional judgment to determine, what does sophistication mean? What does it look like? And it's not Narnia that just emerges. We have a sense ahead of time of what that might mean and what it might look like. Does it have to do with consistency? Does it have to do with voice? Does it have to do with evidence? Like, what is it? But by determining that ahead of time, we can actually see that learning, and we know how to then talk to the student about it and help them understand it.
Yeah, it's quality over counting. Rubrics describe gradations of quality or depth of understanding. So take any performance task, right? There's no mathematical formula of right and wrong with any sort of authentic demonstration of learning. Right? There's no formula that can capture tone, reasoning, or synthesis. Human interpretation is the mechanism of fairness and judgment, right? That's the ironic part. Some people don't believe that, but our judgment is actually what creates fairness.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Because that's such an interesting line. Human interpretation is the mechanism of fairness.
Yeah. Our interpretation based on clear criteria, right? So we talk about the 2021 study that was done using rubrics where teachers were given samples and without the guidance of the criteria. And that's the key, is we have to use the criteria to base our judgments on. And this is how we gain sort of calibration on how we make our judgments. So the 2021 study was done with teachers. They were given 2 writing samples, and they were asked which of the writing samples is on grade level. They were virtually identical in their construction, right? But each was given a different name at the top, right? And one of the names at the top was Connor, and the name at the top of the other paper was Deshaun. Kind of know where this is going. I think I've talked about this study in past episodes before, but I believe it was about 6% less likely Deshaun's paper was to be deemed at grade level. Then they introduced a rubric, and the rubric essentially did it again with 2 almost identical papers. They did it again, and the introduction rubric almost neutralized implicit bias. So by introducing the criteria, it actually created fairness and judgment, right? So our interpretation of the evidence based upon the clear criteria. We have to understand it's not human interpretation based on anything. It's human interpretation based on the established criteria creates fairness and equity, because there is no grading by name or being influenced. And the key is that we have to acknowledge we all have, or at least are susceptible to implicit bias. Anybody who says, I don't have bias, I don't believe them. We have to put in safeguards to make sure that we are being fair in how we interpret evidence, right? There's judgment in everything. We established that earlier in the episode. So by putting criteria in place and talking to my colleagues about how to score things, that helps me recognize that my judgment is on point with my colleagues, and there is consistency with how we interpret. In the assessment world, that's known as reliability. So once we have reliability, but I need to be reliable with myself. There's something called intra-rater reliability, and that is how consistent am I from the first paper to the 30th paper.
I'm laughing because we all have been there. Like, oh, I'm a little tired.
That's right. And we start to let a few things go when we're 5 deep. We fan them out. We do all sorts of things.
Save the best one for the end.
That's right. We grade like figure skating judges, and we can't do that. So there's inter-rater reliability, which is between you and I. Then there's intra-rater reliability. When I'm marking papers and I'm on number 16, am I consistently interpreting the evidence the same way I did with the first sample and the 30th sample? Having criteria is not going to hurt. It's going to help you. And so that interpretation is where we start to create fairness and equity.
That's a fascinating study. Thank you for saying more about that, because I think in our Canadian context, this is more important than ever before to really step into a place where we have a pluralistic, diverse society, which is something we pride ourselves on as Canadians. Yeah. But if then at the other side of our mouths, we're saying, I don't need to use criteria because, I'm just doing this subjectively, then things are starting to fall apart because the criteria is starting to filter its way in regardless. And it changes per kid, per name, like you said. So that was a really important example, I think. But Tom.
Okay.
Let's talk about building confidence in judgment. How can teachers feel less fear and more confidence?
You mentioned Thomas Guskey earlier, and I want to quote both two friends of ours in connections, Tom and Leanne Young, wrote an article a number of years ago about, and this question came up in their article, it was an ASCD article about why teachers don't trust their professional judgment. And one of the number one assertions they made in that article is that the reason many teachers don't trust their professional judgment, and again, this is not a critique of teachers. No. This is just the systems we've set up. The reason many teachers don't trust their professional judgment is because they're not sure if their colleagues would make a similar judgment given the same body of evidence or the same evidence, right? So how do teachers get comfortable trusting their judgment again? They have to collaborate.
Yeah, obvious answer.
I know that, it's such an interesting dynamic because I heard this expression probably 20, 30 years ago, and it really has stuck with me, which is this: everybody hates meetings, and you can't get anything done without meetings. And the problem we have with meetings is we're meeting for the sake of meeting instead of meeting with a purpose. So collaboration is important. Like, talk about student work with your colleagues. I say to groups all the time, does anyone in this room have all the answers? No hand goes up. I said, then why do we act like we do? When people say, just let me shut my door, just let me teach, like leave me alone, you are saying you have all the answers. And you and I don't have all the answers. No one has all the answers. And I'm just thankful I have you to collaborate with, and we have an opportunity to talk. So talk about student work with your colleagues, calibrate with them, co-score things, and express your judgment, and recognize that we have to be consistent. You may not be identical. It's okay to be one-off. If you say something is proficient and I say it's developing, we're probably both right if we can rationalize it with something in the criteria, because we're human beings. If you say it's exemplary and I say it's proficient, we're probably both right. On a single sample, it is okay to be one-off on occasion. That's why large-scale assessments are done in teams. Right. But if you say it's extending or exemplary and I say it's developing, one of us is wrong. It's a problem. So this is what trusting your judgment starts to look like, is I get to unearth their thinking. So not only do I get to check my judgment, I get to hear how you think through examining evidence. And that, especially if I'm a new teacher, that is so powerful for me. It's some of the best professional learning you can ever experience. And it doesn't happen in a workshop. It happens with your colleagues. So calibrating what proficiency looks like, because this part is absolutely huge. Like I said to you earlier, we have to gauge our reliability both internally and externally, right? You and I, and also with myself, am I consistent from number 1 to number 30 as I'm grading papers? Oh, this is such a huge piece, this idea. We used to call them reliability reviews. Yeah. I don't know if you've heard that language, but we would do this as English teachers all the time because you do feel like you're an island. And the last thing you want to do is be biased and unfair to your students. But something that I think is a misinterpretation of these kinds of protocols sometimes is like, my job is just to align with whatever everyone else is doing, and we're going to point out, who's not on track. But I think something amazing that happens is you actually discover new insights based on what evidence people bring, right? And what they're noticing. And then, like you said, it's that embedded professional learning, and it also helps us make sure we're not unintentionally scoring students lower for things that are just universal design elements. That's what I see a lot of. Right. So folks will say, well, they accessed a graphic organizer to help them plan. Ergo,
I could never give them beyond a novice because only a novice writer would use a graphic organizer. And you've got the rest of the team saying, that's a strategy, an agency. Like, what are you talking about? Yeah. But until you have those conversations, you have a kid who's going into a class and being told they can't write because they did something that in every other classroom would just be seen as agency.
That's so absurd that you would teach a kid a writing strategy and then hold that against them when they use the writing strategy.
Yeah.
That seems
true story.
Like ridiculous. Anyway, what's the second thing?
Document.
Yeah.
Keep really simple records. This doesn't have to be like a huge portfolio make work project for the teacher, but the more that you document and look at evidence of learning through the lens of the criteria that you've established with your team, and hopefully it's criteria that matters, it's on goals that you really care about as a team, the more evidence you look at yourself and look across, I think it's the comparison of evidence that can be so powerful sometimes. Right. The more that you start to build your internal confidence too of like, oh, I know exactly what, and then you also have a bank to pull from to help kids build their confidence because you can share it with them as well.
Nothing onerous, but when your evidence is observation or conversation, then we might want to document a little bit just in a way that's simple and nothing too onerous for you to do. The third thing is to communicate criteria clearly, right? When students and parents understand what each level represents, then the trust in your judgment. I would even go one step further to say, show them how you make those decisions. In a open house or meet the teacher night in the fall, show them examples and say, this is an example of a, if I'm a grade 4 teacher, show them an exemplary paragraph versus a developing versus a proficient paragraph and walk them through in 5 minutes the different elements you're looking for. And this is how I use my judgment to determine what level they're at. So I think clearly articulating criteria, there's such an incredibly powerful thing that happens when we create those. We don't build rubrics just to make rubrics.
No.
And some people who don't like rubrics, I think, have lost the plot. Rubrics are meant to articulate success criteria clearly.
They're a teaching tool. They're not a judgment tool.
That's right.
Because professional judgment is at its strongest when it's transparent. We really do not need to hide behind numbers anymore when we have clear reasoning.
Right. Okay. So let's now, I know something teachers struggle with is how to talk to parents about this. So let's tackle some of those tough parent conversations.
Okay. So one of the biggest questions you'll get if you really want to step into the space is, where's the percentage? What is the percentage? Can you give me the percentage?
Why isn't there a percentage?
I've had so many cases like, can you just slip me one? Like, it's like, what? Do you want me just to make it up? What are you talking about? Yeah. And we have to say to them, because learning isn't that precise. And obviously, and something I want to say as an aside here is less is more, folks. Like if you're talking to parents, don't get into like, well, formative assessment as per the, like just stop.
Don't teacher talk them.
No teacher talk. Keep it really simple. Just talk about concepts of learning. Parents get it. Learning isn't that precise. I base grades on consistent demonstrations of understanding, just not 1 point differences.
Right. Okay. So now a parent says to you, but percentages are more objective. Now, teachers, here's how you might respond to that. You might say, actually, they're not. Every percentage is based on teacher judgment, how the work was marked, what was emphasized, what questions I asked, what was the weighting within the test or the assignment. I use consistent criteria to ensure fairness rather than being swayed by the other aspects that can get involved.
So they come back to you and they say, well, how can I know that this grade is accurate? You say, because it reflects multiple demonstrations over time, not a single test. You can be confident it represents what your child truly knows and is able to do.
Right. And that kind of language communicates confidence, transparency. It communicates your professionalism, and it helps them recognize that you're not being defensive. You are acting as a professional. And this is, I think, a really important quick point about summative assessment, that technically summative assessment is a moment in time where a teacher examines the preponderance of evidence and makes a judgment. I've said this many times on the podcast, but I'm going to say it again. Dylan Williams says, assessment is about gathering evidence so you can draw an inference about the learner. What does this evidence tell me about the degree to which the student has a depth of understanding? So you're not getting defensive, you're expressing your professionalism.
Absolutely. So now we're at a place where we're starting to see a lot of Canadian districts and provinces move towards proficiency-based reporting. Here in BC, now also Yukon, the Northwest Territories are also adopting this BC approach to reporting as well.
And as that happens, professional judgment starts to become even more central, right? Tom Guskey reminds us that credible grading relies not on computation, but it relies on consistency and transparency of our judgments.
So we're at a place where we're excited to report the system is catching up, but it'll only work if teachers believe that their expertise and not an algorithm is what ensures fairness.
Right. So here's the takeaway as we finish up. Precision isn't necessarily fairness. We want to emphasize the fact that the appearance of objectivity is not the same thing as accuracy.
Yeah, numbers can summarize learning, but they can't represent it. Only teachers can do that.
Right. So this week, listeners, we want you to think about this. Look for one place where you can trade a calculation for interpretation. Just if this is something that is relatively new to you, and we know it's not new to a lot of folks, but if it's something that is relatively new to you, just look for one place where you can trade calculation for interpretation, where you can replace a number with maybe a conversation.
And remember, trusting your judgment isn't arrogance. It's professionalism.
And that is the heart of credible assessment.
Okay, that's it for this week. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Assess That.
And don't forget to follow Assess That on Twitter or Instagram. We've got links in the show notes for both of those.
If you have any specific topics that you'd like us to talk about, please shoot us a DM on either one of those platforms.
And a reminder to check the show notes for the links for the upcoming professional learning events we mentioned in the opening of the podcast.
Please subscribe, rate, review the podcast, as that really helps us to grow the podcast reach.
And finally, if you like what you're hearing, please keep spreading the word about the podcast to your friends, your colleagues, or on social media. We would really appreciate that.
Now remember, assessment isn't just a tool, it's a conversation.
And together we're here to make it a better one.
See you in 2 weeks, everyone.